Morning, morning monsters. I decided to stand up today for a little bit of change, just a bit more energy in the room. I don't know, the sun's out, I'm feeling a little bit more vibrant, maybe it's all the skating, but I did want to talk about monetization. Specifically, monetization in the metaverse. It's a complicated and layered topic. We've got the issue of actually monetizing inside of the metaverse in terms of content created in or specifically for the metaverse. And then we've got the topic of support content, if you will. So basically, how do we slice those two up? The simple way of saying it is the support content can be used in other places. It could potentially be used in multiple metaverse spaces. But then the in situ content, the metaverse mechanic content, is deeply tied into whatever specific metaverse you're in. So these things could be things from developers, season passes, developer-made cosmetics, things like that, things you buy from the in-game store, but they don't actually have to be content per se, like avatars or worlds or whatever. They can be tickets or access to the content, whether it's a one-time event, whether it's a disposable or consumable item, those kind of things. So I'm going to start off on the support side because I think at the moment, given the early stage we are in all of this, we don't know what metaverses will succeed. I also think it's the most realistic form of monetization at the moment. So what's required for this kind of monetization to work? Well, first and foremost, the licensing agreements of the specific platform. It's a bit of a grey area here, but basically some platforms will allow commercialization of this stuff, some platforms won't. Realistically though, I don't know of any platforms that are harsh on off-platform monetization of content. So you're generally in a safe area. The most active community of this is the VRC prefabs, VRC creator kind of communities. The nice thing about it is because so many of them are using a fairly standard and fairly common way of building these avatars or these environments, you as an artist can create a rig or create props or models for these 3D worlds and sell them literally as the props and models. You don't have to sell them as the fully imported thing. So your commerce is happening entirely outside of the sphere of these controls of these companies. It's probably the most robust way to make money in the metaverse at the moment. And this is all kicked off, by the way, because someone was asking a question about which metaverse to monetize in, and they were using the example of Neos having cryptocurrency in it. We'll get to that. But realistically, and it came up in the comments, and it was a very good discussion in that video. But realistically, I think the best bet is if you can do out of world or out of metaverse prop construction at the moment. I think that's one of the most viable commission-based policy kind of things. One of the tough things is because you're doing it out of world, there is no DRM on there. There is no protection on there. So you as an artist are handing over, the Photoshop files, the FBX files, the blend files, the Maya files, Max files, whatever. But you're handing over the blueprints to make as many of a thing as can be made and modify as many of a thing. You're relying on purely legal enforcement, of which, to my knowledge, I don't know of any. There may be some, but I don't know of any cases where art theft has been prosecuted. It's an interesting challenge, especially when you're designing avatars, right? Because the human form is relatively consistent. In theory, we're protected by IP laws, but I think we might end up a lot more, just from a pure case of enforcement, because it's so difficult, might end up more in a trademark area. And I'm going to talk about the equivalent of the analog hole in a bit, but that's there. So that's a healthy ecosystem that exists. I don't need to explain it to you. It's fairly standard, whether you're doing commission work, whether you're doing patron work, fairly standard. Then you get the in-metaverse creation. Now, if you're looking at something like Dreams, if Dreams were to become a metaverse, it doesn't allow importing, so this off thing. So you'd then potentially be making stuff in-world, similar with Neos. You'd be making stuff in metaverse to sell. And this is where the licensing and terms of these transactions get tricky. Now, in theory, the transaction could happen off platform, so you could change money with PayPal hands or whatever, but that doesn't remove the legality issues. I think in practical terms, most platforms will turn a blind eye to this, at least for a decade or so, just because it's too damaging to the platform to really stamp down on this. They want people to be sharing and to be earning money off their platform. The real thing stopping them usually is it's a legal minefield, because the moment they acknowledge that and they accept any indemnity for that, then the enforcement and the regulation of that becomes a thing. And there's a lot of difficulty about when your software, your game, or your platform can become a monetary instrument. There's a whole world of, one of the reasons why art made so much money back in the day was laundering money. It was the way people laundered money. Thankfully, the art laundering thing became so big by the time they started cracking down on criminals using physical art to launder money. The trade had been so well established that it survived that downpress effect. There's a similar thing happening in free-to-play and digital spaces. There's some really good articles written on it. It's troublesome. It is troublesome because, at the end of the day, these things do fund things like sex trafficking and drugs and murder and all kinds of nasty things. But the periphery of it is you just see a lot of these new frontiers of finance being abused. So yeah, there's a lot of legality, there's a lot of auditing, there's a lot of technical challenges when you enter that space. So a lot of most platforms will want to go into that space. Like I can guarantee you now, like VRChat wants to have a creator-to-creator commerce, right? Because they want their 10%, 30%, 50%, whatever their cut is they're going to take. They want that. But the legality and the burden of taking that on is just so huge. They're probably waiting for a certain level of inertia or maybe acquisition to get to the point where they have a big enough umbrella that they can take that hit. Now, one of the ways some of these people get around this is, rather than engaging with financial institutions, they use cryptocurrency. It's a neat idea. The problems beyond the environmental externalities and the issue of it's just a lot of compute to run crypto. The regulations catching up on crypto, and realistically, in the near future, all the problems of fiat currencies will start appearing with cryptocurrencies if you're using them as this transmission medium. So yeah, we're in a tough way there, and I think there's going to be a lot of nudge, wink, wink behavior around metaverse monetization, where I make a thing for you because I'm your friend, and you as my friend have put 100 quid in my bank account, and so there's going to be a lot of that going on. And because of all of this, the real security and protection work, I don't think is going to happen in a meaningful way. So I do think we're going to get into this world where content ownership isn't going to be respected fully. It gets worse than that. because unless we're going to a cloud gaming future, remember we did that previous video on, is metaverse code executed locally, remotely? Is it executed everywhere? Is it in order? We did a whole video on how we can do those kinds of things. But ultimately, anything that is executed on your machine, you have all the assets to run and you can grab. And obviously anything rendered on a machine, you can grab. Now, that's not to say there aren't some fairly obvious obfuscation techniques that could be done by these platforms to protect their assets. Obviously, there's like a high-level thing of you shouldn't be storing the FBX files unencrypted on the disk, or you shouldn't be like storing these raw assets as a cache like there. You know, we have enough compute that a little bit of encryption on the stuff isn't a huge deal. But then the caveat, they come back to you and they say, well, to send it to the graphics card, we need to, have it in a nice format, no encryption and any of that jazz. And that's true. And this is where we get into a thing of how much do we value the performance versus how much we value the protection of the content. There's going to be a lot of push and pull here. Anyone who remembers the early days of video streaming, the early days of internet stuff, we had a lot of these similar fights. Ultimately, video DRM is now implemented pretty strictly at a browser level, and we have things like DHCP and all that kind of stuff, but it took decades to get there. So I don't expect this to be a problem solved overnight. Purely from a technical point of view, there's some fairly simple obfuscation you can do with some basic compute shaders to make it that if someone's running Ansel or one of these photography capture programs where they can capture the models and stuff, you can make it harder to do this. But in the large part, I don't know if there's going to be, because there's none of this, the platforms themselves aren't getting a cut, I don't know if there's going to be enough motivation for any of the platforms to do this. So then do we acknowledge that this hole exists, this analog hole where we will all leak our models, we'll all leak our textures and our content and stuff. Scripting stuff may be a bit more secure depending on the platform. Some platforms use fairly open formats. It is tricky. I think one of the platforms that is going to be the most protected is something like Dreams, because your implicit, assuming the entire client isn't compromised, your implicit shapes, your actual sculpts and stuff that make the model up aren't ever sent to the GPU wholesale. And we could actually, in theory, not ever transmit. I mean, at the moment we do because it's just so much more efficient, but we could not ever transmit the actual shape edit. We could send out something like the actual compiled voxels or like post-evaluation steps. So there's ways with these intermediate formats where instead of sharing the Photoshop file, you could be sharing the JPEG, right? And so then we've got a low resolution JPEG here, and the master copy, the highest quality version of the asset is not exposed, and that's a good thing. That's a really nice compromise to tackle this problem. But it is a compromise because I think the history of the internet has shown people will watch the latest release at 240p with someone standing up in front of the camera and walking across the cinema. I mean, I don't think people would do that now, but for a long time people put up with that. And so I think you will get in these VR metaverses people happier to walk around in their knockoff Versace or their knockoff Nanichi or whatever, mixing fashion and avatar worlds. Yeah, but I do think fashion is actually where we're going to be pulling the most inspiration from. Remember how I said art theft is very difficult to enforce? Well, I think fashion is going to hit the similar problems to fashion as what we're going to hit with a lot of these 3D spaces, especially when we're starting to talk about photogrammetry, when we're starting to talk about wider access to these kind of tools. And there I think trademark starts to become a bigger deal. Now the question is the trademark a visual trademark, or is it a label, right? So if you were an avatar creator, say, and you had a logo that appeared on your avatars, the moment, if that logo was registered as a trademark, the moment that logo is reused anywhere, then you have a very substantive way to block that. There's no legitimate way to copy that, even if it's drawn by hand from scratch. If it's recognizable as the logo, it's recognizable as the logo. If someone is running around with an avatar similar to yours and doesn't have that logo, or they go into a world, or they interact with the Rubik's Cube that you've made or something, and it doesn't have that, great, it's a fake. I personally hate the logification of fashion, because I think it leads to shittier designs, because everyone's just a capitalist billboard. But hey, whatever. There is another way we can do this, and that is the label. So you look at the label. The problem with the label is that in fashion, basically, no one ever looked at the label, because who the hell cares? In digital spaces, we can make it a bit easier. With this whole NFT explosion, put it aside all of the other discussions around NFT. Essentially, all you are verifying is a token or a label, right? You're not encrypting the art itself. So that's kind of how we're solving the problem for digital art, which we got all these similar problems. So yeah, there could be a thing in the metaverse, and this is quite easily enforceable, and you don't have to use cryptocurrency. You can use the equivalent of a fiat currency, which would be a centralized ownership server or certificate authority, or various other cryptocurrencies. Not the only way to solve this. Don't let the silicon nerds go, oh my god, cryptocurrencies are going to solve everything. It's a very useful tool, and distributed ledgers are great technology. But when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. There is good reason to have centralized repositories of ownership, purely from indexing and looking up and figuring out who has what. Yes, they can be compromised, but yeah, there's ways of running small distributed ledgers, and we have models from the stock market, for instance, where yes, you have the actual paper certificate that's this is the stock, but then we trade futures and all kinds of crazy stuff. So there are ways and means we can scale this out and not burn the planet up in crypto. But essentially what we would be trading there is we would be trading a little label of authenticity. And so it becomes a question of, culturally, does little Bobby or does Susie care that you're wearing a knockoff or not? There was a time in fashion and handbags and accessories and stuff where you proudly wore your knockoff that you had bought from a street store or whatever, because it's look at me, I'm smart enough to find this technically legal knockoff, which is an identical copy, but the brand is one letter different or whatever. Does that become part of culture? Ultimately, it's like a scarcity society. Do we even want to push this as a society? Because the only thing we really want to happen is for the artists and the creators to be able to continue to create their stuff. So we want them to be able to make money, which is why we started this conversation with patronage, and we're going to kind of circle the conversation back to patronage, because I think that's where a lot of this is going to be. I think, yes, we're going to have authorized labeling, and I think we don't want to put all our eggs in the patronage basket, but just where the metaverse is going and where all of these 3D spaces and environments are going, I think copyright law is outdated. Culturally, our practices do not match our legal things, and we need to have more of these battles in courts, because I think most people would agree where we are culturally is just too far removed from copyright law, versus where copyright law is way too draconic. And so there is a there is a melding that needs to happen there. We need to reach a more common ground, and it's a tricky one because it's not a thing you can solve at a national level because there's so many international trade agreements. There are countries that have wanted to push one way or the other on the cycle, but they're literally bound and gagged by these international agreements, most of which have been pushed by the US, to be honest. The US has been a real big push on it, and it's only recently that they've started to like bring China in and stuff, but then China's culture is so far removed from this. But yeah, so there is a problem culturally and legally that we have to work out there. That being said, in the near term, the next 5-10 years, we're going to be seeing a lot of this ripping assets from old video games and throwing them into the metaverse. If I go out and I do photogrammetry of a statue, and I bring that statue in, and is that a bad thing is the question? Because, if you're pulling sprites from NES games and you're grabbing old PlayStation 2 or even modern models from like the latest Uncharted, this becomes a thing. But if you look at the history of art, people were cutting up magazines, they were using prints. It becomes a really, really tricky ground because I think culturally we do want to play in the sandbox where we can take mosaics of culture and smash them together. We want Shrek and Thanos to have an arm wrestle. We want to go to the moon for cheese and, talk to Sonic and, or we want to just meme on things like the Suez Canal, right? And the ship trapped. Meanwhile, I'm sure that there is some law that actually would stop us, in theory, perfectly replicating that ship because there is image licensing or weird things there. But we want to be able to do all of these things in the metaverse, and have done a lot of these things. So it's a tricky problem because when you say to someone, oh, I want to throw Spider-Man in the metaverse, everyone's like, oh, that's totally chill. Because that's how they feel. But then when you say to someone, hey, this artist who barely can pay their rent, we want to copy their avatar because they won't sell their avatar to less than $1,000. The reason is because they're doing so low volume, they need that kind of commission fee or whatever to, just pay their bills. Then we start to get into a tough area. But I don't think we are going to see a very good enforcement model and structure from the companies themselves. There's just too much. There are things they can do, but there's so much indemnity, there's so much liability, and we haven't even touched on the web metaverse and open stuff, which is even more antagonistic to DRM models and it's gonna be a tough time. And if you want to monetize the metaverse, as it were, you need to be comfortable with the fact that you're going to be in a lot of legal gray areas. You're going to be working off platform in the majority, and you have to be comfortable with the idea that your art is going to be stolen, it's going to be redistributed. You need to not do any huge projects where it's like this project is make or break, which is a good thing anyway. You don't ever want make or break projects like that because you need to just expect this cycle, and that's kind of where we are going to be. It's the world we will be living in, or are currently living in. That being said, I think that's everything I needed to say on the topic. Let's see, anyone? Okay, cool. Okay, that's monetization in the metaverse. I'm glad we had a little chat, and I will see you on Monday. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.